I'm going to make 3 points today, and the first is very simple. It's that global warming is real, meaning that the climate has warmed over the last century, and that human activities, the burning of fossil fuels, is the primary cause of that warming. And that may seem like I'm preaching to the choir here, but I think as Kenny will say shortly, that there's still a lot of misunderstanding and skepticism within the general public about the reality of global warming. But I want to emphasize that that is not the case within the scientific community, that there is solid scientific evidence and a strong scientific consensus about the reality of global warming. And some of you may have heard of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC. And what they came out with a report a couple years ago in 2007. And what I've shown up there is just the bottom line take-home message from that report. And that report says that warming is unequivocal, and most of the warming of the past 50 years is very likely due to increasing greenhouse gases. And the point I want to make with this is that the scientific consensus wasn't always there. If you look at previous reports from the IPCC, and they've been put out periodically starting in 1990, you can see that there's been as the scientific evidence in support of global warming has accumulated, there's been a growing confidence among the scientific community about the reality of global warming. And so what I've listed here are just the take-home messages from all the previous reports. And if you compare the 2007 message to the 1990 or 1995 message, you can see that there's been a clear increase in our confidence, and that reflects the growing scientific evidence and our increase in understanding about climate change. Now, the IPCC is not alone in this. It's not just the climate scientists who believe this. The National Academy of Science, the most prestigious scientific organization in our country, along with the national academies of dozens of other countries, have all endorsed that bottom line take-home message from the 2007 report. Global warming is real, and that humans are causing that. And it's not just the National Academy, but every scientific organization of relevance to this issue has endorsed that statement. So this is simply not something of the IPCC alone. There is a broad and widespread scientific consensus about this. Now, the second point I want to make is just relating to the time scale of global warming. And so what I've shown here are observations of the global temperature over the past century, and from paleo records there in gray, from 1000 AD out to 1850. And you can see the temperatures were fairly flat, and then during the 20th century, the temperatures rose, and the global mean temperature has risen by about 1 degree Fahrenheit over the last 50 years. And then to the right of that, in the gray area and the colored lines, you see model projections for what the temperature change will be over the next century. And depending upon our choices of emissions and so forth, the warming could be as little as 3 degrees Fahrenheit or as large as perhaps 10 degrees Fahrenheit by the end of the century. But the point here is that the process of global warming occurs over decades. There is a very long time scale to it. And there are two consequences of that. The first is that we are already committed to additional warming. Even if we could stabilize greenhouse gases at today's levels, if we could stop injecting any more CO2 into the atmosphere, we are still catching up to our past greenhouse gas emissions. And so the planet will still warm by another 1 to 2 degrees Fahrenheit. And that warming, there's simply nothing that can be done to stop that. The second point is that while there is some additional warming that is already in the pipeline and that we are committed to, the decisions we make today about future emission scenarios won't really affect the climate that we'll see over the next 10 to 20 years. It won't really affect the climate that we experience, but it will affect the climate for future generations. So what we are deciding now is what climate future generations will inherit from us, and that's the decision we're making. And this is where the question of global warming moves from simply a scientific or economic question to an ethical one. is it right for us to determine the climate that future generations will receive from us? And now, the third point I want to make is just to illustrate the consequences of global warming. And I think perhaps the best way to do that is with sea level rise, and South Florida is a very good example of this. And these are some slides that I've borrowed from my colleague, Harold Wanless at the Geology Department. And what this shows here is South Florida, the topography of South Florida in 1995, and in those pretty colors you can see the flow of water from the Everglades out into Biscayne Bay. And you can see the little arrow there, I tried to point to, roughly where we are now. And so you can see Miami Beach and Key Biscayne there. This is what South Florida would look like with a 3-foot rise in sea level. And a 3-foot rise in sea level is now a middle-of-the-road projection for what sea level rise would be under a business-as-usual scenario by the year 2100. It is not an upper end. It is a middle-of-the-road. And you can see South Florida is completely different. The Everglades are gone. Dade County, Miami, and even into Broward are basically a peninsula now. And so you can clearly see that there are tremendous consequences associated with climate change. And sea level rise is just one of them, but it's a very visual one. And clearly, I think this is one of the greatest issues facing South Florida over the next century.